Hi and welcome back. In this video we'll be learning about the aorist tense, and this will allow us to start talking about the past. So far we've only been able to talk about the present. The aorist tense is often used to talk about the past. It's like the English simple past tense. The aorist is also the default or unmarked aspect. If you remember, we saw that present tense has a significance beyond just indicating present time. The present aspect is our view on the action when we're looking at the action as a continuing or repeated process. Aorist aspect has less significance, really. It views the action as a simple whole. So if we were to imagine our aspect as our perspective on a train passing by, where the present aspect involved us standing up close to the train so that we notice the cars whipping by, or standing at the beginning of the train so that we see it approaching, those sorts of close-up perspectives. The aorist aspect is like standing way back so that we can see the whole train at once, and we don't think about one part being emphasized more than another. We just see a train. Outside the indicative mood, then, the aorist is actually the default tense, not the present tense. Once we get outside the indicative mood, so with infinitives and imperatives, for example, there's no time significance. So the past time implication is only true with the aorist tense in the indicative mood. In other moods, there's no time significance to the aorist, and again, the aorist aspect doesn't put any particular emphasis on one part of the action. So that makes it a good default for expressing yourself if you're using an infinitive or an imperative. There are, though, some interpretive hazards with the aorist aspect, most of them based on past misunderstandings of the aorist tense. One thing it doesn't do is tell us anything about the nature of the action itself. So remember, aspect is just where we're standing, so to speak. It's just our perspective, what we're choosing to focus on, the way we're choosing to view the action. The difference between present aspect or continuous aspect and imperfect aspect or unmarked aspect, the difference between these two has nothing to do with the difference in the actions themselves. It only has to do with the difference in the way we're looking at them. So that means that sometimes you'll hear people talk about the aorist tense indicating that an action takes place once or once for all. But this simply isn't true. The aorist tense, again, only tells us how the action is being portrayed at the moment, not what the action was like in its performance. Here are the parts of an aorist indicative mood. We have something at the beginning that we haven't seen before, and that's called an augment. It's an epsilon with a smooth breathing mark. The augment only shows up in the indicative mood, and wherever it shows up, it indicates more or less past time. Sometimes an augmented verb can be used for present time, but in general, the augment indicates past time. Then we have the verb stem. We're using luo here, so we have our stem lu. Then there's a tense marker. Sigma is the primary tense marker that comes between the stem and the connecting vowel and signals, hey, this is an aorist. The connecting vowel then for the first kind of aorists we're going to be looking at is typically an alpha, and then we add personal endings on the end. So the first person plural form would be augment, lu, sigma tense marker, alpha connecting vowel, men, elusamen. We've so far been working with what are called the primary personal endings. And if you remember, when we learned the present tense endings of luo, the basic endings before we add the connecting vowel in the stem look like this. Nothing in the first person singular, then sigma in the second person singular, iota in the third person singular, and then in the plural, men, te, and nc. All of the verbs we're going to be learning in Greek use either these personal endings, the primary personal endings, or what we call the secondary personal endings. And the secondary personal endings are similar in some places. So the second person singular is still a sigma, the first person plural is still men, and the second person plural is still te. But now in the first person singular, instead of no ending after the connecting vowel, we have a nu. And we have the same ending in the third person plural. We don't have that nc ending anymore. We just have a nu, the same as in the first person singular. Finally, in the third person singular, instead of the iota, we have really no ending, unless, for pronunciation's sake, we add a movable nu on the end of the form. But the ending itself is really a null ending. Now, in the first aorist active personal endings, that means the first style or first kind of way we form the aorist, we use those secondary personal endings, except that we don't put on the nu in the first person singular. And you'll find in general that if verb declensions are going to, or verb conjugations are going to be irregular, they'll be irregular usually in the first person singular. But everywhere else we're using those secondary personal endings that I just described. And the reason we're using those is because the aorist is an augment tense. I just showed you that because the aorist in the indicative mood generally points to past time, we put an augment on the beginning. And any tense that can receive an augment in the indicative mood uses these secondary personal endings. So what do these look like once we add the connecting vowel and the tense marker? Well, in the first person singular, we have sa. In the second person singular, sas, the sigma there. In the third person singular, se, or sen. And this is the one place, the third person singular, where the alpha connecting vowel becomes an epsilon. You just have to keep that in mind. Then in the plural, the first person is samen, the second person plural is sata, and the third person plural is san. And just to make sure you understand what these forms are that we're looking at, this is everything that you put on after the verb stem to make a first aorist. You've got the sigma tense marker, the alpha connecting vowel, which occasionally in the third person is epsilon, and then the secondary personal ending. So here are some examples of the forms of luo in the first aorist. Now we've added on the augment at the beginning and the verb stem. So in the first person we have elusa, then elusas, eluse or elusen, elusamen, elusata, and elusan. One thing we should notice before we get too much further is what happens when we put an augment on the beginning of a verb that already begins with a vowel. Hagiadzo is one example, and when we put the epsilon augment at the beginning of the hagiads stem, what happens is that the epsilon is absorbed by the alpha and lengthens it. So instead of hagiasa, we have hagiasa. The alpha has lengthened to an eta, but we don't have a separate augment. That means that when we're looking at verbs, at first aorist verbs, we're going to have to look not just for the separate augment, the epsilon, but also for a lengthened initial vowel if the stem starts with a vowel. What do we mean when we talk about a vowel lengthening? Well, each short vowel has an equivalent long vowel, or a long vowel that's sort of paired with it. The one confusing thing here is that epsilon and alpha, when they're short, both lengthen to the same letter. They both lengthen to an eta. So there isn't a separate long alpha. Long epsilon and long alpha are both eta. But omicron does lengthen to omega. So omicron lengthens differently than the other two short vowels do. Another piece of theory that's useful to have in mind when we're constructing first aorist verbs is what's called the square of stops. And this is a way of categorizing 9 consonants that are called either labial, velar, or dental. And it's 3 sets of 3, hence the idea of a square. The labial stops are called labial because the labia are lips in Latin, and they're formed, these consonants, formed putting the lips together or touching the lips to your teeth. So p with p, b with beta, and f with phi are all made with our lips. So we call them the labial consonants, or the labial stops. The velar stops are the consonants that are made by touching the back of our tongue to this part of the roof of our mouth, our soft palate, or the rear part of the roof of our mouth. And so the Greek consonants made that way are kappa, k, gamma, g, and chi, ch. Finally, the dental consonants are the ones that are used by touching our tongue to our teeth or just behind our teeth. And these are tau, t, delta, d, and theta, th. We can also, if we look at the columns, categorize these slightly differently. Some of these consonants are voiceless. In other words, we don't use our vocal cords at all when we pronounce them. We just make the sounds p, k, and t. And the only sound we hear when we actually use the letter is the breath that explodes out from our mouth. On the other hand, we can have voiced consonants of each kind. So instead of p, I can make the sound b, and now I'm using my voice box while I pronounce the letter. Similarly, the velar voiced consonant is g. Instead of k, it's a voiced sound g. And the voiced dental consonant is d, delta. The third column then includes voiceless fricative consonants, and fricative consonants are ones that are rough. So the labial fricative is f, like an English F sound. The voiceless fricative velar consonant is chi, which is again a rough sound. And the dental voiceless fricative is th, again like a rough th sound like our English th. You don't have to remember those columns unless you find it helpful. What you do need to remember is the rows. Which consonants are the labial stops, which are the velar stops, and which are the dental stops. It's important to learn this square of stops because the different categories of stop consonants do different things when they come at the end of a verb stem and run into the sigma tense marker. So labial stops, p, beta, and phi, when they run into the sigma tense marker, become a psi. You can tell the sound is just as if we had a p followed by sigma, ps, but the Greeks actually created a letter for that. If we have a velar stop, a kappa, gamma, or a chi, followed by the sigma tense marker, that becomes a xi. And if we have a dental stop, a tau, a delta, or a theta, and that comes at the end of the verb stem and the sigma tense marker comes up against it, the dental stop disappears. It's absorbed by the sigma tense marker, and we're left just with the sigma. Let's see now how this works in practice. If we take the verb kathidzo, I sit, the present stem is kathids. But when the zeta at the end of the present stem runs up against the sigma tense marker, the zeta is absorbed by the sigma, and we just have the aorist form ekathisa, I sat. Why? Well, because zeta actually, for these purposes, acts as if it were a dental stop. In addition to the tau, the delta, and the theta, we have to include also the zeta and sigma as well. Because when any of these consonants comes before the sigma tense marker, it's absorbed and all we have is a single sigma. So kathidzo becomes ekathisa. Dioko has that kappa velar stop at the end of the stem, and so when diok meets the sigma tense marker, the kappa and sigma combine, just like any velar stop combines with the sigma, to form a xi, and the aorist form is edioksa, I pursued. Blepo has a stem that ends in a labial stop, the P there, and so when blep runs up against the sigma tense marker, the P and the sigma combine, and we get a psi, a blepsa, I saw. There's a slightly different kind of combination that happens with first aorist liquid verbs. That is, verbs that have a liquid consonant as the last consonant of the stem. What do we mean by a liquid consonant? These are rho, nu, and lambda, and it's a consonant that you can continuously pronounce without stopping or without having to stutter. So we can make an sound for a long time, or an sound with nu, or a l sound with lambda. Those are the liquid consonants. So if the stem ends in a liquid consonant, what happens is that instead of the stem consonant being absorbed by the tense marker is absorbed by the liquid consonant. So meno uses the slightly changed stem, aorist stem main, but the important thing to notice here is that sigma tense marker is absorbed by that nu, and we get the aorist form emena, I stayed. Similarly, stello uses the aorist stem stale, and when we add the sigma on after that lambda, the sigma is completely absorbed, and we end up with the first aorist form estela, I erected, I stood up. Finally, with agero, when we add the stem ager with the final rho on the end of the stem to the sigma tense marker, the sigma tense marker is absorbed by the liquid consonant, and we have just agera instead of agersa. And agera means I lifted. Usually if the stem of a verb ends in a short vowel, that short vowel will lengthen when it bumps up against the sigma tense marker of the first aorist. This is usually the case with contract verbs. So zao has the stem za, zeta alpha, and when we add the sigma tense marker following that, it becomes ze, because the alpha lengthens to an eta. So we have the first aorist form, not edzasa, but edzesa, I lived. Zeteo, similarly, the epsilon lengthens to an eta when it bumps into the sigma tense marker, And so instead of edzatessa, we have edzatesa, I sought, I looked for. With doulao, similarly, the omicron lengthens to an omega, and we have edulosa, I enslaved. But it's not just contract verbs that do this. We sometimes see this with other verbs too. Histemi, for example, has the stem sta, sigma tau alpha, and when that alpha at the end of the stem bumps up into the sigma tense marker, it lengthens again to an eta. So instead of estasa, we have estesa, I stood. There are just a very few verbs that use a kappa tense marker instead of a sigma to form their first aorist form. And the three examples that you'll see frequently are pharaoh, tithemi, and didomi. In each of these cases, the stem that's used in the aorist is different than the stem in the present tense. And we're prepared for this with me verbs, right? Because we talked, when we learned the me verbs, about the fact that the present tense stem has reduplication, and the real stem is going to be shorter. So with tithemi, the real stem is the, and so if we add the augment, epsilon, onto the the stem, we add a kappa instead of a sigma tense marker, and then the regular ending. The only other thing to notice here is that, predictably, the short vowel at the end of the stem, the, lengthens so that epsilon becomes an eta, and we have etheka instead of etheka. But it's a kappa that's used here instead of a sigma. That's the important thing to remember. Similarly, the real stem of didomi is da, ending in an omicron, and so we add a kappa instead of a sigma on after that da stem. The omicron lengthens to an omega, and we get edoka, I gave. The first verb in this chart here, pharaoh, you might not expect to use a different kind of stem in the first aorist, but it does. And the first aorist stem is something like eneg. When we add the kappa onto that, and the regular endings, and when we lengthen the initial epsilon, because we're adding the augment on, we end up with the aorist form enenka, I carried. There is a second way to make the aorist, and don't worry, it's not really that much harder, but we'll need to use both techniques for forming the aorist at different times. So the first way to make an aorist verb was to add the sigma tense marker after the stem and change the connecting vowel to an alpha. The other way to make an aorist is to change the form of the stem itself. So there's no sigma tense marker, and the connecting vowel isn't changed to alpha. It stays omicron or epsilon, just like in the present tense. For example, the aorist forms of erchomai use not the stem erch, but the stem elth. And we don't need the sigma tense marker to tell us that this is an aorist, because we can see that we've got the aorist form of the verb stem, elth. We use the secondary personal endings for the second aorist, and now we use the new that's supposed to be there in the first person singular. So these endings are even more regular than in the first aorist. Nu, sigma, and then nothing in the third person. Men, te, and a nu again in the third person plural. If we add on the omicron and epsilon connecting vowels, that gives us the endings on, s, e, omen, ete, on. And you can see those look more like our present tense endings, although we're using the secondary endings instead of the primary endings. When we add on the augment and stem, then we find that the stem, instead of erch, the present stem, changes to this eilth stem. There's no way of figuring out what the second aorist stem will be. You just have to learn, along with the verb, the aorist form. And in this case, elth is the stem, and so the initial epsilon has been lengthened by the augment to become an eta. That gives us eilthon, eilthes, eilthen, eilthomen, eiltheta, and eilthon. Here are some common second aorist stems of verbs that you've already learned. Erchomai has the second aorist stem elth, and notice that it also becomes active instead of being deponent or middle only in the second aorist, and so the second aorist form in the first person singular is eilthon, I came. Lambano has the second aorist stem lab. This gives us the first person singular aorist form elabon, I took. Pipto has the second aorist stem pes, and generally the second aorist form then is epeson, although in the New Testament for some reason we can also have the first aorist alpha style endings added onto the second aorist stem for pipto, so it can be epeson or epesa, I fell. Fugo has the second aorist stem fug. Notice that the epsilon drops out and we just have phi upsilon gamma. The first person singular form then is efugon, I ran away, I fled. And echo becomes esk, which gives us eskon, I had. Another common second aorist verb is ago, and the irregular second aorist stem just reduplicates the present stem. So the second aorist stem is agag instead of just ag. If we put that together with the augment and the omicron connecting vowel and the second aorist ending, that gives us the second aorist form agagon, I led. And notice there the epsilon lengthens the alpha at the beginning of the stem. Occasionally, we'll find that the aorist stem is actually supplied by a completely different verb. And often this happens when the present tense of another verb is no longer really used. And so the aorist form of that other verb gets borrowed by the first verb. A good example of this is horao, which becomes in its aorist stem id instead of hora. Where does the id come from? Well, it's not even a changed form of hora. This is borrowed from another verb entirely. But that means that once we put the epsilon augment on, we get the aorist form adon. Again, we've got stem change, the augment on the beginning, and the secondary endings with the omicron connecting vowel. This is actually quite regular, just like the other second aorists we've seen. But the stem here, the aorist stem, is even more different than the changes we've seen in some verbs. And adon means I saw. Now, there's one other category of second aorists that acts a little bit differently, and these we call the thematic second aorists. With some verbs, the aorist stem, the second aorist stem, ends with a long vowel that ends up dominating the forms because it basically swallows up all of the connecting vowels. So with gnosko, for example, the second aorist stem is gno, ending in that long omega, and the first person singular isn't egno-on, but that omicron connecting vowel is swallowed up and it's just egnon. The second person singular similarly is egnos, and the third person is egno, and here the epsilon ending itself is swallowed up by that omega. The plural forms are egnomen, egnota, and then in the third person plural, we have an irregular ending. Instead of egnon again, as we would expect with a second aorist, we get a son ending that almost looks like we're switching back to a first aorist ending with the sigma tense marker. So you just have to remember with these thematic aorists that the connecting vowels disappear behind the long stem vowel, and that third person plural ending acts like a first aorist. Egnon, egnos, egno, egnomen, egnota, egnoson. We see a similar pattern with bino, which is also a thematic second aorist, and the second aorist stem here is be. Instead of an omega long vowel at the end of the stem, now we have an eta long vowel, but the pattern is the same. First person singular is ebane, with the eta eclipsing the connecting vowel. Then we have ebase, ebe in the third person singular, which swallows up the ending completely. And in the plural, ebamen, ebeta, and then that irregular ebason that acts like a first aorist. Histemi is one of these very, very rare verbs that can act like either a first or a second aorist. When it acts like a first aorist, we use the real stem sta. But when it acts like a second aorist, the stem seems to be stay, ending with a long eta, and it acts like one of these thematic second aorists. So if it's acting like a second aorist, the forms of histemi would be estain, I stood, estes, you stood, este, and then in the plural, estamen, esteta, and esteson. So which do I use? Students often wonder at first whether to use the first or second aorist endings. And the answer is that it depends on the verb. Each verb will use either the first or the second aorist. You just have to remember which verb uses which kind of aorist. And the vocabulary chart in Paideia gives the aorist form for verbs. So if you forget, you can look it up on the vocabulary chart. And if the aorist form has the sigma alpha tense marker and connecting vowel, then it's a first aorist. If it has no sigma tense marker and it uses an omicron connecting vowel, then it's obviously a second aorist. A general good strategy is to learn the second aorist forms. There are fewer second aorist verbs, and they're used a fair amount often. So learn those, and then assume that all of the other verbs are going to use the first aorist. Before we leave the aorist verbs, it's important to note just a couple of other things about augments. One is that when you add an augment onto a verb with a prepositional prefix, the augment goes between the prefix and the verb stem. So for example, in prosphero, pros is a preposition that's added on as a prefix to the main verb pharaoh. So instead of eprosphere something, the epsilon augment goes after the pros prefix and before the verb stem. So we have pros enenka, I offered. Similarly, the epsilon goes after pros in proskuneo, and so we end up with the aorist form prosekuneo. Peripateo becomes periepatesa. Apothnesko becomes apethanon. Apodidomi becomes apedoka. And paristemi becomes parestein. But the basic idea that you need to keep in mind is that in addition to watching for the augment lengthening an initial vowel on the verb, another way that it can kind of hide is by hiding in between a prepositional prefix and the main part of the verb. Another thing to look out for with augments is that sometimes if a verb begins already with a diphthong, the epsilon can't really lengthen that diphthong, and it disappears. So with the verb eusabeo, when we try and add an epsilon onto that eu initial diphthong, we can't. And so we just have eusabesa, I feared God. Similarly, aiteo, you can't lengthen that initial alpha iota diphthong, and so we just have aitesa. Those are both first aorists. A second aorist example of the same thing is heurisco. We can't lengthen the hu diphthong at the beginning, and so we end up just with huron, I found. One other odd exception has to do with the verb thelo, I want. Thelo uses an eta instead of an epsilon for its augment. And so instead of a form like ethelesa, we have the form athelesa, I wanted. This is because the original stem wasn't thel, the way it appears in thelo, it was ethel, with an epsilon at the beginning of the stem. And so originally ethelo meant I want. Then naturally, if you add an epsilon augment at the beginning, since there's already an epsilon there on the stem, the two epsilons fuse and form an eta at the beginning of the verb. In Hellenistic Greek, very often that initial epsilon has dropped off and the verb is just thelo. But for some reason, in the aorist form, the eta augment has hung on. So if you can remember that thelo used to be ethelo, that'll make it a little bit easier to remember to use an eta augment on thelo. The other odd thing is that even though it's not a contract verb, thelo inserts an eta in front of the tense marker. So it's as if the original stem weren't just ethel, but were ethele. And the imaginary epsilon there, that vowel lengthens before the tense marker from an epsilon into an eta. That may or may not help you to remember this, but the form, in any case, of thelo is, in the aorist, formed by the epsilon augment plus the sort of imaginary stem ethele with that old epsilon at the beginning and an imaginary epsilon at the end, plus the sigma tense marker and the alpha. And both of those epsilons on this stem, both of those imaginary epsilons, lengthen to etas. So the resulting aorist form is athelesa, I wanted. This is a lot to take in all at once, and I'm sure you'll want to come back and review this video a few times. But you can also find more about the Aorist Tense and Aorist Aspect in Mounce's Basics of Biblical Greek, and I've given you, as usual, the page numbers and section numbers for the 3rd edition.